Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a conqueror or a philosopher, but with a plant that's been confusing governments, healing bodies, and sparking debates for thousands of years. Cannabis. You're about to drift through a story so old that by the time you wake up, you'll probably still be in the Stone Age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in roughly 50 BC, somewhere in the windswept plains of Siberia, the Stone Age. Civilization is still beta testing itself. People are inventing pottery, domesticating animals, and dying from things as trivial as standing near the wrong mosquito. Somewhere in this frozen landscape, a forager, tired, cold, probably contemplating the meaning of their brief existence, tosses a handful of plants onto the campfire for warmth. They take a deep breath, and suddenly, the smoke does something unexpected. The world softens, colors seem brighter. That tree over there, it's never looked so fascinating. Archaeologists have uncovered cannabis seeds in ancient burial sites across Central Asia, which tells you something profound. Someone valued this plant enough to take it to the grave. Either it was sacred, or it was the prehistoric equivalent of, "Don't bury me without my stash." Knowing human nature, it was probably both. These early encounters weren't about transcendence or rebellion. They were about survival. Cannabis fibers made the strongest ropes anyone had ever twisted. The seeds were edible, packed with nutrition. The plant was basically nature's Swiss Army knife. You could sail with it, tie things with it, wear it, and if you accidentally set it on fire, suddenly the clouds looked hilarious. Imagine being one of the first humans to inhale cannabis smoke intentionally. No one to warn you what's coming. No munchies in the pantry. No Bob Marley to set the mood. Just raw, unfiltered confusion, and maybe a very deep conversation with a rock that isn't talking back. Early humans probably didn't think they were getting high. They thought the gods had upgraded their vision, granted them access to a hidden layer of reality. And in a way, maybe they had, because from that accidental puff, a legend was born. A plant that would travel continents, inspire poetry, trigger paranoia, fund entire musical genres, and never, ever go away. Here's the mainstream fact. Cannabis has been used by humans for at least 7,000 years, primarily for fiber and food before anyone figured out its psychoactive properties. But here's the quirky bit. Some researchers believe Neolithic shamans may have deliberately cultivated high THC strains specifically for ritual use, making them humanity's first pharmacologists. Historians still argue whether early humans stumbled upon cannabis's mind-altering effects by accident or whether someone, somewhere, was brilliant and bored enough to experiment on purpose. Before the word weed even existed, cannabis had already outsmarted us. It found the one species dumb enough to cultivate it, worship it, outlaw it, and smoke it, often in the same century. And you, lying there in the dark, are part of that same species, the descendants of those confused foragers who looked at a burning plant and thought, let's see what happens. Humanity, meet your oldest love-hate relationship. It's a bond that's survived ice ages, empires, and moral panics. And tonight, you're going to see just how far this little green plant has traveled, from the frozen tundra to the emperor's palace, from burial mounds to medical scrolls. Cannabis kept showing up, not with armies or conquest, but quietly, stubbornly, like every good idea humans tried to suppress. And as you drift deeper into this story, you'll see that cannabis didn't just witness history, it shaped it, one puff, one rope, one ritual at a time. You're waking up now in 2700 BCE, and China is busy inventing everything: paper, silk, bureaucracy, and apparently the world's first medical endorsement for getting high. Enter Emperor Shennong, known as the Divine Farmer, which sounds noble until you realize it means he spent most of his reign testing random plants to see which ones would kill him. The man was basically the world's first clinical trial, except there was no control group, and the only safety protocol was, let's see what happens. According to legend, Shennong discovered hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng, tea, and yes, cannabis. His book, the Pen Cao Qing, reads like an ancient Yelp review for plants. Good for pain, gout, rheumatiz, and forgetfulness, which is darkly ironic because cannabis probably caused the forgetfulness he was treating. To Shennong, cannabis wasn't a vice. It was medicine. The Chinese didn't roll it up or pass it around like some hazy drum circle. They brewed it into tonics, ground it into powders, and probably called it something profoundly wise, sounding like wind-calming elixir or spirit of the balanced earth. It treated fevers, calmed nerves, eased childbirth pain, and made people slightly too confident about their poetry. By this point, hemp was everywhere, spun into rope strong enough to haul ships, woven into clothes that lasted longer than marriages, and pressed into paper that would eventually hold the wisdom of an entire civilization. You could live your whole life surrounded by cannabis, your clothes, your scrolls, your fishing nets, your mild painkiller after a long day in the rice fields. It was like living inside history's first eco-friendly empire. Here's your mainstream fact. Cannabis was listed in the Pen Cao Qing as one of the superior herbs prescribed for over 100 ailments in ancient Chinese medicine. But here's the quirky detail. Some Tang Dynasty texts suggest that Taoist alchemists burned cannabis while attempting to create elixirs of immortality, which makes you wonder if they ever succeeded or just got so high they forgot they were mortal. Historians still argue whether ancient Chinese physicians understood the psychoactive component of cannabis or simply categorized it as a plant that harmonized energy, leaving the truth somewhere between medical genius and blissful ignorance. Now you're drifting further west, across the steppes of Central Asia, where the Scythians, those horse-riding nomads who looked like they hadn't slept since birth, decided death rituals were missing something, mainly smoke. Around 1000 BCE, these warriors threw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones inside sealed tents. and within minutes the place filled with thick, aromatic clouds. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that they would howl with pleasure, which is ancient Greek for someone's about to have a profound conversation with the cosmos. This wasn't some polite ceremonial puff. This was a full-body baptism in THC. Imagine 20 tattooed warriors crawling into a tent with burning hemp and emerging spiritually reborn, slightly disoriented and absolutely certain they'd just met their ancestors. The smoke wasn't just recreational, it was sacred. It helped them commune with the spirits of the dead, ease grief, and probably made the afterlife sound like a pretty appealing destination. Archaeologists later uncovered golden bongs. Yes, literal gold, buried in Scythian tombs, still coated with traces of cannabis residue. These ancient nomads died the way they lived, stylish, mysterious, and slightly elevated. Other cultures eventually copied the idea. From Persia to India, nomads and mystics alike began inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals, festivals, and philosophical debates. Because if you're going to question the meaning of existence, it helps if the air itself is giving you ideas. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, cannabis quietly slipped into the medical papyri. The Ebers Papyrus, a 3,500-year-old medical text, lists cannabis as a treatment for inflammation, glaucoma, and this is bad temper. Priests mixed it into balms and oils for temple rituals, waving censers full of fragrant smoke while declaring it purely spiritual. Sure. And so is tequila. Women used it too. Egyptian midwives prescribed cannabis to ease childbirth pain, which was remarkably progressive given there were no epidurals, just divine chanting and whatever herbs you could smuggle past the high priest. Traces of cannabis have even been found in mummy wrappings, which means someone thought, if I'm crossing into eternity, I'm bringing something to take the edge off. From China's imperial courts to Egypt's temples to the Scythian steppes, cannabis had become the quiet diplomat of the ancient world, crossing borders, cultures, and belief systems without firing a single arrow. It was medicine, ritual, and rope. It was practical and sacred, and everywhere it went, it left behind the same question. Were we using it, or was it using us? You're drifting now into India, around 1500 BC, where cannabis didn't just arrive. It was welcomed like a divine gift. By the time it appeared in the Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's 4 sacred texts, cannabis had been elevated from useful plant to holy sacrament. It was listed as one of the 5 sacred plants said to be a gift from the gods, specifically Shiva, who according to legend discovered it beneath a celestial tree, took a few hits, and promptly entered a state of divine chill. From that day forward, Shiva earned the title Lord of Bhang, which is arguably the most spiritually relaxed job description in human history. Bhang wasn't smoked, though. It was drunk, a thick, milky concoction made from crushed cannabis leaves, spices, nuts, and the vague promise of enlightenment. Priests, yogis, and festival goers would sip it during ceremonies, praise the gods, and then forget what they were praising halfway through. Here's your mainstream fact. Cannabis has been used in Hindu religious rituals for over 3,000 years, particularly during festivals like Mahashivaratri, where devotees consume bhang as an act of worship. But here's the quirky bit. Some ancient Sanskrit texts describe cannabis as the liberator of sin, suggesting early Indian scholars believed it could literally cleanse karma, which makes you wonder if enlightenment was always this accessible or if they just had better marketing. Historians still argue whether the Vedic references to soma, a mysterious divine plant, were actually about cannabis or some other hallucinogenic herb, leaving the true identity of India's original sacrament frustratingly unclear. Festivals like Mahashivaratri became full-on divine parties where worshippers stayed up all night, singing hymns, dancing, and drinking bhang until they could practically see the universe vibrating. It wasn't considered rebellious or illegal. It was sacred. In temples, cannabis purifying the spirit. In villages, it helped you tolerate your relatives. It was medicine, meditation, and mild escape, all in one convenient leaf. And while other civilizations treated cannabis as a ritual tool or trade good, India gave it a personality, playful, spiritual, and stubbornly human. It wasn't just a plant. It was a companion on the path to understanding the cosmos, or at least pretending to. Now you're floating further east again, back to China, but this time into the mysterious world of Taoism. Around 1000 BCE, Taoist monks believed that burning cannabis incense helped them communicate with spirits and glimpse the future, which, if you've ever tried it, probably looked amazing for the first 10 minutes and mildly terrifying for the next 2 hours. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes called the liberator of sin, which sounds uplifting until you realize it also made people wander into forests trying to have philosophical conversations with clouds. Monks would burn it during meditation, claiming it helped them open the gates of perception. Translation: they got so elevated they could hear their own heartbeat in surround sound. China's relationship with cannabis was complicated, though. It wasn't a party drug. It was a philosophical one. Taoists weren't interested in escaping reality. They were trying to merge with it, which is just a fancy way of saying, let's get introspective enough to think the universe is our roommate. The early Chinese were far too organized to let things spiral out of control. Cannabis was carefully measured, mixed with other herbs, and written about in scrolls that probably smelled faintly of smoke and existential contemplation. You didn't just light up. You followed a procedure, meditated first, and hoped not to levitate into a wall. Meanwhile, the Confucians, those eternal voices of reason, frowned upon anything that loosened the mind too much. The Taoists said cannabis expanded consciousness. The Confucians said it expanded laziness. It was the first recorded drug policy debate in history, and it ended the same way all of them do. Everyone pretending to agree while doing whatever they wanted at home. Through it all, cannabis remained the quiet companion of China's mystics, burned in temples, studied by scholars, and probably blamed for at least one lost manuscript about immortality that someone swore they'd written but couldn't quite remember finishing. From India's joyful devotion to China's careful ritual, cannabis had found its place in the spiritual architecture of the East. It wasn't rebellion. It was religion. It wasn't escapism. It was enlightenment, or at least a very convincing dress rehearsal. And as empires rose and fell, this humble plant kept whispering the same promise, that transcendence wasn't reserved for kings and priests, but available to anyone brave or foolish enough to breathe deeply and let go. You're traveling now along the Silk Road, that legendary artery of commerce that stretched from China to the Mediterranean, and somewhere among the camels, spices, and silk bolts, cannabis hitched a ride, quietly, stubbornly, achieving what every empire dreamed of: total globalization without firing a single arrow. Picture it: a caravan winding through the deserts of Central Asia, traders sweating under relentless sun, and somewhere in the back, a carefully wrapped sack of cannabis seeds labeled for medicinal purposes only. It was the ancient world's version of a customs declaration, and everyone knew it was half true at best. Along these routes, cannabis became a shapeshifter. In China, it was medicine and paper. In India, it was sacred. In Persia, it became wisdom wrapped in smoke. And by the time it reached the Middle East and North Africa, it had transformed into hashish, portable, potent, and infinitely more interesting than the sermons allowed. Here's your mainstream fact. The Silk Road, active from roughly 130 BCE to the 1450 CE, facilitated the spread of cannabis across 3 continents, introducing it to cultures that would integrate it into medicine, religion, and daily life. But here's the quirky detail. Some medieval Arabic texts describe traveling Sufi mystics who carried compressed green cakes of hashish, essentially the world's first edibles, which they consumed to enhance spiritual visions during long desert journeys. Historians still argue whether the famous assassins of Alamet actually used hashish before their missions, or if the entire legend was propaganda invented by terrified crusaders who couldn't admit they were being outsmarted by sober, disciplined warriors. Speaking of the assassins, let's pause in 11th century Persia, where cannabis gained its first real PR problem. The Nizari Ismailis, a secretive sect led by Hassan I Saba from his mountain fortress of Alamet, became legendary for their precision strikes against political enemies. Medieval chroniclers, mostly European, swore these warriors smoked hashish before missions, moving in a blissful haze of divine purpose. The term assassin itself supposedly derives from hashishin, or hashish users. It's a thrilling story and almost certainly nonsense. In reality, there's no evidence these men ever used hashish operationally. The myth was probably cooked up by their enemies, who needed an explanation for why a small group of mountain warriors kept outsmarting entire empires. Blaming drugs was easier than admitting the other side had better tactics and intelligence networks. They're not brilliant, they're high, became medieval damage control. But the story spread like wildfire through crusader camps. European knights returned home whispering tales of Eastern killers intoxicated by strange herbs, and the word hashishin mutated through languages until it became assassin. Just like that, a religious sect, a military tactic, and a drug fused into one sensational headline that lasted 900 years. The Nizari Ismailis were actually scholars, engineers, and diplomats more than anything. They built libraries, negotiated treaties, and only eliminated targets when absolutely necessary, which admittedly was still quite often. The real irony? The myth survived while their castles crumbled, and cannabis gained a new reputation, from sacred plant to suspicious substance. Meanwhile, merchants didn't just sell silk and spices, they sold culture. Every trade stop became a swap meet for ideas, stories, and the occasional cloud of aromatic smoke. You could hear Sanskrit hymns blending with Persian poetry, while someone in the corner accidentally reinvented the hotbox for the third time in human history. Arab physicians, particularly during the Islamic Golden Age, explored cannabis extensively in medical texts. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi described it as useful for pain, digestive issues, and calming of the spirit, which is medieval code for take one and stop arguing about theology for 5 minutes. But Islam had a complicated relationship with intoxication. The Quran forbade alcohol clearly, but said very little about cannabis. That left room for interpretation. And wherever interpretation exists, humans immediately find loopholes. Enter hashish, the original gray area of divine law. Sufi mystics embraced it fully. These were the spiritual poets and dancers of Islam, the ones spinning in circles and claiming union with God through prayer, music, and occasionally substances that made God seem unusually chatty. For Sufis, cannabis wasn't a vice. It was a bridge, a fragrant pathway to the divine. Meanwhile, the religious establishment frowned. Hashish dens popped up from Cairo to Baghdad, filled with scholars, merchants, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Authorities called it a moral plague. Preachers condemned it as the herb of idleness. And yet, every crackdown failed, mostly because the enforcers also needed to confiscate large amounts of evidence for personal inspection. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's open secret. Poets praised it, rulers banned it, doctors prescribed it, and beggars smoked it. Everyone had an opinion, and half of them forgot what it was mid-sentence. The Silk Road had turned cannabis into the first truly multicultural plant, crossing languages, religions, and moral codes. And everyone pretended they were only using it for healing. Whether you were a monk in Chang'an, a merchant in Samarkand, or a mystic in Cairo, the smell was universal. Smoke, dust, and the faint promise of enlightenment just one breath away. You're waking up now in medieval Europe, and the continent has already perfected a sophisticated system for handling new ideas. Fear them, ban them, then quietly use them anyway. Hemp had been around for centuries as rope, oil, and fabric. Nobody thought twice about it. But the moment someone decided to light it up instead of weaving it into sucks, the church got very, very involved. To be fair, medieval Europe wasn't exactly in the mood for experimentation. Between crusades, famines, plagues that wiped out a third of the population, and the occasional Viking raid, people were barely holding things together. The church controlled everything: law, medicine, your odds of eternal happiness. And it wasn't thrilled about substances that made peasants giggle during Mass. Still, cannabis slipped through the cracks. Monks grew hemp in monastery gardens to make parchment and prayer robes. all while writing lengthy moral condemnations of sinful herbs. It's safe to assume at least one monk tried the product and had a profound spiritual moment involving a candle flame and 37 consecutive Gregorian chants. He suddenly understood on a cosmic level. By the 13th century, doctors and apothecaries were quietly prescribing cannabis oil for pain, fever, and what they delicately called female complaints. It worked, which made it suspicious. Anything that cured suffering without direct divine intervention raised eyebrows, and occasionally torches. Here's your mainstream fact. Hemp cultivation was widespread across medieval Europe for industrial purposes, so crucial that in 1533, King Henry VIII actually mandated that English farmers grow it to supply the navy with rope and sails. But here's the quirky bit. Some medieval herbalist texts describe cannabis as useful for melancholy of the spirit and vexations of the mind, suggesting physicians may have understood its mood-altering properties long before anyone admitted it publicly. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans deliberately avoided documenting cannabis's psychoactive effects due to church pressure, or whether they genuinely didn't make the connection between the plant they wore and the plant that altered consciousness. Meanwhile, travelers returning from the Crusades brought stories of hashish dens in the East, dark, fragrant rooms full of relaxed people who weren't killing each other. Naturally, Europe found this horrifying. Chroniclers described Saracens who smoked madness into their souls, which translates roughly to, they looked happy, which was clearly demonic. Before long, cannabis joined the growing list of things the church disapproved of. Pagan rituals, heresy, women reading, dancing, and now good moods without sufficient penance. Officially, it was labeled a devil's herb. Unofficially, it was still being used by midwives, herbalists, and anyone with chronic back pain and a realistic view of God's priorities. So Europe managed to take a versatile, harmless plant and turn it into a moral crisis. A skill it still hasn't lost. Hemp stayed legal as long as it behaved itself and stuck to making rope. But the moment it hinted at pleasure or altered states of mind, it was excommunicated from polite society. Thus began Europe's longest-standing tradition, being both terrified of and utterly dependent on the same thing. By the late Middle Ages, cannabis had survived everything. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, entire civilizations burned to ash, and yet this scrappy green plant just kept growing wherever people were stressed and soil existed. The age of exploration was basically powered by weed, not the fun kind, but the kind that held up ships. Columbus wouldn't have made it to the New World without hemp rigging, hemp caulking, and probably hemp underwear that chafed terribly but lasted forever. So yes, in a very real way, cannabis accidentally helped discover America. Still, its reputation remained split. To the working class, it was a practical crop. To doctors, it was medicine. To the church, it was one more thing to blame for moral decay. Every group needed it, hated it, or both, which is more or less the story of civilization in a nutshell. By the Renaissance, scientists were dissecting everything from corpses to philosophy, and cannabis quietly snuck back into medicine cabinets. Apothecaries sold it for pain, seizures, and sleeplessness. Poets hinted at it in verse. Shakespeare himself may have enjoyed it. Archaeologists found traces of cannabis in clay pipes excavated from his garden, though whether he used it for inspiration or just really liked his gardener remains an open question. And while Europe still officially frowned upon pleasure, it had also just invented gin, so moral judgment was becoming increasingly selective. Then came the colonial era, where cannabis sailed across oceans again, this time in every direction. The Spanish planted it in the Americas. The Portuguese took it to Brazil and Africa. The British industrialized it on a massive scale. Every empire claimed it was introducing a useful agricultural resource, which is history's polite euphemism for "we're cashing in." By the 19th century, cannabis had gone from sacred to scandalous to scientific. Victorians used it in tinctures for nerves, sleep, and hysteria, while politely ignoring that half their society was addicted to laudanum. Doctors praised it, artists whispered about it, and then, as always, governments panicked and outlawed it. Because nothing frightens authority quite like people being relaxed without permission. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, still debating the same plant, a plant that outlived pharaohs, philosophers, popes, and prohibition. It built ships, healed wounds, started myths, funded entire musical movements, and occasionally made people stare at wallpaper for hours, convinced it contained the secrets of the universe. Humanity keeps trying to control cannabis, but somehow it always slips through our fingers. One puff, one poem, one perfectly rolled piece of history at a time. You're floating now through the 19th and 20th centuries, where cannabis faces its strangest transformation yet. From ancient medicine to public enemy, by the 1800s, Western medicine had finally caught up to what the rest of the world had known for millennia. Cannabis tinctures lined pharmacy shelves across Europe and America, prescribed for everything from migraines to menstrual cramps to insomnia. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, reportedly prescribed her cannabis for menstrual pain, making the British monarch possibly the most medicated ruler since the pharaohs. Medical journals published studies praising its therapeutic benefits, and respectable doctors recommended it without a second thought. It was legal, common, and utterly unremarkable, until suddenly it wasn't. Here's your mainstream fact. Cannabis was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1850 to 1942 and was widely prescribed by physicians as a mainstream medicine before Prohibition. But here's the quirky detail. During the 1893 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, the British colonial government conducted one of history's most comprehensive cannabis studies, interviewing over 1,000 witnesses and concluding that moderate use was essentially harmless, a finding conveniently ignored during later prohibition efforts. Historians still argue whether the eventual criminalization of cannabis was driven by genuine health concerns, racial prejudice against Mexican and Black communities, or corporate interests from the emerging pharmaceutical and synthetic fiber industries that saw hemp as economic competition. The shift began in the early 20th century, and it had less to do with science than with fear, politics, and profit. In America, Mexican immigrants brought the tradition of smoking cannabis recreationally, During the Mexican Revolution, the word marijuana, a Spanish term most Americans had never heard, was deliberately used in propaganda to make the plant sound foreign and threatening. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about reefer madness, claiming cannabis turned peaceful citizens into violent criminals. Films depicted wholesome teenagers taking one puff and immediately descending into gas-fueled chaos, moral corruption, and, gasp, interracial dancing. Harry Anslinger, America's first drug czar and a man who apparently never met a moral panic he didn't want to amplify, led the charge. His testimony before Congress was filled with racially charged rhetoric and fabricated horror stories. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind, he declared, ignoring thousands of years of evidence to the contrary. By 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively banned cannabis in the United States, not on medical grounds, but through bureaucratic strangulation, requiring impossible to obtain tax stamps for any legal use. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry was developing synthetic alternatives to natural remedies, and the burgeoning petrochemical industry saw hemp, which could produce paper, textiles, plastics, and fuel, as a threat to their timber and oil monopolies. Some researchers believe the prohibition of cannabis had as much to do with eliminating industrial competition as with any concern for public health. William Randolph Hearst, who owned vast timber holdings for paper production, ran relentless anti-cannabis propaganda in his newspaper empire. The conspiracy theories practically write themselves, except they're fairly well documented. The prohibition spread globally. By the 1960s, the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs classified cannabis alongside heroin, and most countries followed suit. The war on drugs became official policy, and cannabis, the plant that had sailed with Columbus, clothed ancient emperors, and healed patients for 7,000 years, was now classified as having no accepted medical use. It was one of history's most dramatic reversals, turning medicine into contraband within a single generation. Yet prohibition never actually worked. Cannabis continued to spread, now wrapped in rebellion rather than ritual. The 1960s counterculture embraced it as a symbol of resistance against authority. Musicians wrote anthems about it. Artists claimed it enhanced creativity. And despite decades of arrests, seizures, and propaganda, more people used cannabis during Prohibition than probably ever had before. The war on drugs became the world's most expensive failure, costing trillions of dollars and millions of lives, while the plant itself remained as available as ever, just far more dangerous because it was unregulated. Now, in the 21st century, the pendulum is swinging again. Countries are legalizing cannabis for medical and recreational use, acknowledging what ancient physicians knew instinctively. Research suppressed for decades is finally being conducted, revealing therapeutic potential for chronic pain, epilepsy, PTSD, and dozens of other conditions. The same governments that once imprisoned people for possession are now taxing legal sales. It's a strange redemption arc. Cannabis going from sacred to criminal to legitimate again, as if history decided to hit the reset button after a century-long detour into madness. And yet, Millions remain incarcerated for cannabis offenses, their lives destroyed for possessing a plant that's now sold legally a few states away. The scars of prohibition run deep, disproportionately affecting communities of color who were targeted most aggressively. The story of cannabis isn't just about a plant, it's about power, control, who gets to decide what's medicine and what's contraband, and how easily fear can rewrite thousands of years of human knowledge. So here you are, thousands of years after that first Neolithic forager accidentally inhaled smoke and forgot why they went outside. Cannabis has survived ice ages, empires, religions, and prohibition. It's been worshipped and demonized, prescribed and criminalized, celebrated and suppressed. And through it all, the plant itself remained unchanged, patient, green, and stubbornly resilient, waiting for humanity to remember what our ancestors always knew. And now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift like smoke on a gentle breeze, let this story settle into your mind. You've traveled from Siberian campfires to Chinese dynasties, from Indian temples to Persian trade routes, from medieval monasteries to modern courtrooms. You've watched a single plant weave itself through the entire tapestry of human civilization, changing everything and nothing at all. The same questions remain. What is medicine? What is sacred? What is forbidden? And who decides? But tonight, those questions can wait. The history has been told, the journey complete. Cannabis endures, as it always has, growing quietly in the margins of empires, waiting for the next chapter to begin. For now, let yourself sink deeper into comfort, knowing that some stories are older than nations, wiser than laws, and patient enough to outlast every attempt to silence them. Sweet dreams, wanderer, until we meet again in another corner of history. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through time, leave a like and subscribe for more stories that'll help you drift off while actually learning something. Drop a comment about which historical topic you'd like to explore next. And now, let the darkness embrace you. Sleep well.